So I will start my presentation by introducing the objectives of this mapping of capacity building assets. Then I will present the strategy we have followed in this process, and I will end my presentation with some final results and conclusions. So we had three objectives in this task of mapping capacity building assets. They are, firstly, to map the existing assets and evidence on integrated care at international, European, national, and regional levels. Second one, to identify and tailor relevant capacity building assets on integrated care that could help to address the needs and priorities of our European regions, the ones that are involved in zero exchange. And finally, to facilitate the integration of those assets with the knowledge management hub. So what we did first was to define what the capacity building assets meant for zero exchange, and we agreed that they are available resources and evidence that support the stakeholders to increase context maturity for integrated care, health and social care, in the 12 dimensions of the zero maturity model. So we developed a search strategy to map and select those assets with so those that are associated with the 12 dimensions of the zero model. And it is based on two methods: a search of rare literature from the zero exchange regions, which we call desktop search, and a search of existing literature from the scientific databases that we have named literature review. So both approaches are qualitative. In the desktop search, we requested to the participating regions to select two key informants, experts in integrated care, and ask them to identify, select, and chart assets that they consider useful to advance on integrated care. And we mapped them in an Excel sheet. And in the literature review, we defined a strategy to identify published scientific papers and select, chart, and then map the ones that are relevant for the zero exchange project. To map them, in this case, we use the RevWorks software. Once mapped, all the assets were shared with our colleagues of the Edinburgh University, the knowledge management help developers to fit the knowledge management. So to focus both searching methods, we define a series on inclusion and exclusion criteria and the success of search for both methods. So for the desktop search, the assets need to be related to integrated care, linkable at least to one of the zero maturity model dimensions, developed in the last 10 years, accessible in English or in the languages of the rest of the European, the European regions that take part in the project, and the geographic coverage was international. Also, we defined some exclusion criteria. They couldn't be published in traditional academic publishing and distribution channels, no drafts, and no confidential material. Finally, we proposed some sources of search to our experts of the different regions, so they could search for assets in their own web search engines, the libraries, websites, and so on. And for the literature review, we also defined inclusion criteria. They are the same, but we only were looking for English literature. And the sources of search were mainly PubMed, Medline, Embase, SeekInfo, and GOS. So once the assets were selected, meaning that they met the inclusion criteria, not the exclusion criteria, we charted them to connect each asset to the dimension it links, helps to address, and if possible, to the score of the assessment scale of that link dimension that could help a healthcare system to reach. So the assets were charted based on their topology, the dimension or dimensions to which it is linked, and the maturity readiness levels it could contribute to reaching. I will go briefly through each of them. So, the type of assets we selected are scientific papers in the case of the literature review, and in the desktop search, regulation or guidelines documents, strategic and consultation documents, reports, project documents like deliverables to the mission, products, outcomes, guidance documents, good practices, tools, and technical and commercial documentation. So the assets were also charted due to the dimension of the link, as I said before. And for this, we have used the PS model for making qualitative questions in qualitative research of the McMaster University. With it, we built 13 research questions, one about integrated care in general, and one for each of the 12 dimensions of the Sirocco model, trying not to miss any relevant asset. I will not go into all of them, but let's see the one of the first dimension, readiness to change. It is how do healthcare stakeholders deal with fostering readiness to change from a fragmented model to an integrated model. And so we did the same with all the rest of the dimensions. And finally, only for the desktop search, we charted assets due to the score that they could help, as I said, a healthcare system to reach in the dimension it links with. For this, we developed what we called the maturity readiness levels that standardize the scores of the scales of the 12 model dimensions. So ML0 means score 0 of the Sirocco maturity model scale in all dimensions, and MRL5 score 5 in all dimensions. So they are: MRL1 is awareness raised, 2 small scale deployment and/or planning, 3 mid-scale deployment and/or initial institutionalization, 4 large-scale deployment and extended institutionalization, and 5 full deployment and/or institutionalization. Well, and this is a real example of one of the assets we mapped. We did it in the desktop search through this template form. So this way we could summarize all the key information. Here we have included the type of the asset, the dimension it links with, MRL, as this is for the desktop search, title, author, year of publication, region, country where it was developed, SARS, a brief summary of it, some keywords to find it easily in the Knowledge Management Hub, and the access details. So before presenting the results of these tasks, I will go through an example, the same that Andrea used on her presentation, to try to clarify this charting method. I will use the population approach dimension in this case. So imagine that we are a healthcare system that scored 0 in the maturity assessment in this dimension, in an assessment we carry out in a region. And our aim is to increase this scoring 1. So to go from a maturity readiness level 0 to a 1. So we will need assets or information from others, maybe, to address the population approach dimension and to help the system to reach a number of 1. For example, the Basque Country strategy on chronicity. Then imagine we make a second assessment and we score a 1, but we want to reach a 2. So in this case, we will need an additional asset, for example, a guide on risk stratification. And this will be the same for the rest of them. That's why we try to chart in all the assets to at least one dimension or to at least one MRL. Okay, so I will finalize my presentation by showing the results, as I said. So in the desktop search, we mapped 385 assets. You can see here the distribution among the dimensions. They vary from 32 in removal of inhibitors to 85 in structure and governance. And all of them were identified by the key informats of the regions. In the literature review, we have made 3 searches. The first one, where we developed sentences for each of the PS questions I've shown before. And we found 4,411 assets. We saw that it was not manageable and made us refine the methodology and rethink on a new search sentences. So we repeated the search in 2020 and we got 1,899 assets, which was more manageable. And we, after reviewing them, we selected the ones that we think they could help to a region to advance on each of the dimensions. We made a first search in autumn 2021, and in overall, we have reviewed over 1,700 assets in those 2 years. In this slide, you can see the number of assets that we selected. So in total, we have selected 267 in this literature review process, 232 in the first search, and 35 in the last search. And here is the distribution of the total assets among the dimensions. So a total of 654 assets were mapped between 2019 and 2021, 387 in the desktop search and 267 in the literature review. On average, 119 per dimensions, ranking from 194 in case of the structure and governance dimension to 56 in the case of removal of inhibitors dimension. So we can conclude that although there was not huge variation between the assets linked to its dimension, there were two distinct groups. So 7 dimensions with more than 100 assets mapped, and 5 with less than 100. So in conclusion, this mapping exercise included searching, selecting and charting assets against the 12 dimensions of the zero maturity model for integrated care. The 2 strategies allowed us identifying assets, selecting and charting them, not only scientific evidence but also great literature, often not easily retrievable. We mapped a total of 654 assets. Most of them were published or produced between years 2015 and 2019. And so, as I said before, the objective of this mapping was that they are now used by European countries to improve on the provision of integrated care in their systems. All the assets were uploaded and integrated within the knowledge management hub of Zero Exchange. And now the challenge is to analyze to what extent the assets are useful for the regions using the hub. We will be able to test it in the next coming months and years, as long as they are used by the users of the hub. So we could assess the